Colonel James Wilson checked his watch as he waited in line at the boarding gate. The 72-year-old retired Air Force veteran adjusted his navy blue blazer and gripped his carry-on bag a little tighter. Today's flight would take him across the country to see his grandson Marcus graduate with honors from Howard University. It was a proud moment, one you wouldn't miss for the world. "Next in line, please," called the gate agent with a smile. James stepped forward, his movements slightly slowed by the old injury in his left leg. The shrapnel from that mission in '87 still made itself known when he was tired or when the weather changed. He handed over his boarding pass and ID with a polite nod. "Thank you for your service, sir," the gate agent said, noticing the small veteran's pin on his lapel. James smiled and continued to the jet bridge. Few people looking at James would guess his remarkable story. In his simple clothes and with his humble manner, he appeared to be just another elderly black man traveling to see family. The other passengers didn't see the man who had broken barriers throughout his 35-year military career, rising through the ranks when few people who looked like him were given the chance. As James made his way down the narrow aisle of the aircraft, he moved carefully. His carry-on bag contained a wrapped gift from Marcus and a folder with photographs from his own graduation from the Air Force Academy decades earlier. James had been one of only 5 black cadets in his class back then. "Seat 3A should be on your right, sir," said a helpful flight attendant named Carlos. James nodded thanks and found his seat in the first-class cabin. He had used some of his accumulated miles for the upgrade. At his age, the extra space helped with his leg, and the longer flight would be more comfortable this way. As he settled in, James placed his wallet and phone in the seat pocket and took out the book he was reading, a biography of General Daniel Chappie James Jr., the first black 4-star general in the Air Force. James had met him once as a young lieutenant, an encounter that had inspired him throughout his career. Other passengers filed past. A young mother with a baby took the seat across the aisle. 2 businessmen in suits sat in front of him, already talking loudly about a meeting they were heading to. An elderly white couple settled into the seats behind James, the woman commenting on how excited she was to visit their grandchildren. Through the window, James watched the ground crew loading luggage and preparing the aircraft. He had flown countless times, both as a pilot and passenger, yet he never tired of the miracle of flight. His mind drifted to his own time in the cockpit, the responsibility he had felt each time, the lives literally in his hands. "Would you like a pre-departure beverage, sir?" asked Carlos, returning with a tray. "Just water, please," James replied with a smile. As the cabin filled up, James observed the mix of people around him, different ages, races, backgrounds, all sharing this journey. He thought about how much had changed since his first flights as a young airman, when segregation was still fresh in the rearview mirror. Not everything was perfect now, but progress had been made. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone aboard. James leaned back in his seat, unaware that in just a few minutes, an encounter with another crew member would turn this routine flight into something very different. An incident that would test his dignity and reveal the character he had built over a lifetime of service to a country that hadn't always served him equally in return. The plane pushed back from the gate right on schedule. James settled into his seat, enjoying the extra legroom in first class. The safety demonstration began, and he watched politely despite having seen it hundreds of times before. Old habits from his military days kept him attentive to safety protocols. 20 minutes after takeoff, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began to move around the cabin. James reached for his book and noticed the cabin was getting chilly. The air conditioning on planes always bothered his old injuries. A flight attendant James hadn't seen before approached the first-class cabin. Her name tag read Melissa Barker. Unlike Carlos, who had greeted everyone with warmth, Melissa's face held a tight, forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She moved efficiently down the aisle, taking drink orders from other passengers. When she reached James, something in her expression changed. The smile vanished completely. She looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone noticeably colder than it had been with the businessman in front of him. "Yes, I'd like a coffee, please, and would it be possible to get a blanket?" "It's a bit cold," James said politely. Melissa stared at him for a moment too long. "Blankets are for first-class passengers," she said. James blinked in surprise. "I understand. I am in first class. Seat 3A, he replied calmly, gesturing to his seat. "This is first class," she said slowly, as if explaining to a child. Do you have the right boarding pass? These seats are quite expensive. The businessman across the aisle glanced over, frowning at Melissa's tone. The elderly white couple behind James stopped their conversation. I'm aware, James said, his voice still leveled despite the insult. I used my miles to upgrade. I've been a member of the frequent flyer program for over 30 years. Melissa's expression showed clear disbelief. Let me see your boarding pass again, she demanded, holding out her hand. James reached for his boarding pass in the seat pocket. As he did, the purple heart pin on his jacket caught the light. Melissa didn't seem to notice. Here you are, he said, handing over the document that clearly showed his assigned seat. Melissa had examined it with obvious suspicion, turning it over as if checking for forgery. How did you get this seat? She asked directly. A few nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. The mother across the aisle was now watching openly, her expression troubled. As I mentioned, I used my frequent flyer miles, James replied, his military training helping him maintain his composure. I've accumulated quite a few over the years. Melissa said, reluctantly handing back the boarding pass. I'll check if we have any blankets left. She walked away without taking his drink order, loud enough for others to hear her mutter, people always trying to sit where they don't belong. The businessman across the aisle looked embarrassed. The elderly woman behind James leaned forward. Excuse me, she said gently. Was that flight attendant rude to you? I couldn't help overhearing. James turned slightly. It's all right, he said with a small smile that didn't show the hurt he felt. Not my first time dealing with something like this. Carlos appeared a moment later with a tray of drinks for the other side of the cabin. He noticed James sitting without refreshment. Sir, would you like something to drink? He asked warmly. Coffee, please, James replied. And if possible, a blanket. Of course, Carlos said immediately. I'll bring that right away. As Carlos walked away, James gazed out the window at the clouds below. In his reflection on the glass, he could see the face of a man who had faced discrimination his entire life. From his early days as one of few black cadets at the academy, through his rise to colonel, when many thought he didn't belong there either. At 72, he was tired of having to prove he belonged in spaces he had earned the right to occupy. What Melissa didn't know, what she couldn't see past her prejudice, was exactly who she was disrespecting. And soon, her ignorance would be revealed to everyone on board. Carlos returned quickly with James's coffee and a neatly folded airline blanket. His genuine smile stood in stark contrast to Melissa's cold treatment. Here you are, sir. Cream and sugar are on the tray if you need them, Carlos said, placing the items carefully on James's tray table. Thank you, Carlos, James replied, noticing the flight attendant's surprise at being addressed by name. You're very welcome. Please let me know if you need anything else, Carlos said before moving on to other passengers. James sipped his coffee and tried to return to his book, but his concentration was broken. 40 years in the military had taught him to maintain his composure in difficult situations, but that didn't mean the insults didn't sting. He thought of his grandson, Marcus, who would soon face a world that might judge him by his skin rather than his character or achievements. 20 minutes later, Melissa returned pushing the meal cart. She served the businessman in front with cheerful efficiency, then the mother with the baby. When she reached James, her demeanor changed again. Chicken or pasta? She asked curtly. I'll have the chicken, please, James responded politely. She practically dropped the tray on his table. Some of the sauce splashed onto the white tablecloth. Oops, she said without apology. Napkins are in the tray. The older woman behind James cleared her throat loudly. Excuse me, she said to Melissa. I believe that was quite deliberate. I'd like to speak to the lead flight attendant, please. Melissa's face flushed. Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Not very well, muttered the businessman across the aisle, loud enough for others to hear. James raised his hand slightly. It's all right, he said calmly. No harm done. It's not all right, the woman insisted. I've been watching how she's treated you compared to everyone else. Other passengers were now paying attention. James felt uncomfortable being the center of this growing tension. Throughout his career, he had faced discrimination with quiet dignity rather than public confrontation. Melissa's face hardened. Sir, is there a problem with your meal? She asked James, ignoring the complaints around him. Before James could answer, her eyes fell on something that had slipped from his jacket pocket when he reached for his napkin, a military ID card with the insignia of a full colonel. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. Military discount flyers still need to follow proper procedures, she said, doubling down instead of backing off. James looked at her directly now, his patience wearing thin. "Miss Barker," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to command, "I followed every procedure. I've shown my boarding pass twice. I've been flying with this airline since before you were likely born. I would appreciate the same courtesy you've shown to other passengers in this cabin." Several passengers nodded in agreement. The mother across the aisle was now filming discreetly with her phone. Melissa's face flushed deeper. "Are you accusing me of something?" she demanded, her voice rising. "I'm simply requesting professional service," James replied evenly. "People like you always play the race card when you don't get special treatment," she said, too loudly. A shocked silence fell over the first-class cabin. The businessman across the aisle stood up. "That's completely inappropriate," he said firmly. "I want to speak to your supervisor right now." Carlos, who had been serving in coach, returned to first class and immediately sensed the tension. He approached quickly. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, looking between Melissa, James, and the now agitated passengers. "No, it's not," said the elderly woman behind James. "This young lady has been treating this gentleman shamefully." Melissa turned to Carlos. "These passengers are interfering with my duties. The man was questioning my service." Carlos looked at James, who sat with military straight posture despite the humiliation being heaped upon him. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience," Carlos began. "He doesn't need to apologize," the businessman interrupted. "She needs to be removed from this cabin immediately." As the situation escalated, James closed his eyes briefly. He had faced worse in war zones and Pentagon meetings, but in those moments, his uniform had made his rank and achievements visible. Here, in civilian clothes, Melissa saw only what her prejudice allowed her to see, not Colonel James Wilson, decorated war hero and barrier-breaking military leader. And she had no idea what was about to happen next. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Carlos stood beside Melissa, clearly unsure how to handle the situation. Other passengers watched with a mix of discomfort and outrage. The mother across the aisle was still recording discreetly, her phone partially hidden behind the airline magazine. "Perhaps we should discuss this in the galley," Carlos suggested quietly to Melissa, trying to defuse the situation. "There's nothing to discuss," Melissa replied, her voice still carrying to nearby passengers. "I'm following company procedures." From a few rows back, a woman in her mid-40s with short black hair and glasses stood up. She had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Dr. Sandra Chen, a professor of military history at Georgetown University, recognized James Wilson immediately, though she hadn't wanted to intrude on his privacy when boarding. "Excuse me," Dr. Chen said, moving forward. "I couldn't help overhearing, and I feel I should speak up." Melissa turned with an exasperated expression. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it does concern me," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "It concerns everyone when a distinguished veteran is treated this way." She turned to James with genuine respect in her eyes. "Colonel Wilson, I'm Dr. Sandra Chen from Georgetown. I've studied your career extensively for my course on barrier-breaking military leaders. It's an honor to meet you, sir, though I wish under better circumstances." A murmur went through the cabin. James nodded politely to Dr. Chen, though he seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "You know this man?" Melissa asked, her tone suddenly uncertain. "Many people in military and academic circles know Colonel James Wilson," Dr. Chen said clearly. "He was one of the first black colonels to command an integrated Air Force base. He's been awarded the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and numerous other commendations during his 35 years of service." The businessman who had been defending James looked impressed. "Is that true?" he asked James directly. James nodded slightly. "I served my country as best I could," he said simply. Carlos's eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, Colonel Wilson from the 44th Tactical Air Wing." "Sir, my father served under your command in the early 90s. Staff Surgeon Miguel Rivera. Miguel, James said, his face softening with genuine warmth. Outstanding communications specialist. How is he doing? He's retired in San Antonio now. He still talks about how you were the best commander he ever had, Carlos said, his voice filled with admiration. He says you saved his career when others wanted to discharge him after his injury. Melissa stood frozen, her face paling as the true identity of the man she had been treating so poorly became clear. The elderly woman behind James spoke up again. My husband was Air Force too, Colonel. Different generation, but the same commitment to service. I recognized your bearing immediately. Some people, she glanced pointedly at Melissa, should learn to see beyond the surface. More passengers were turning in their seats now, many using their phones to search for information about Colonel James Wilson. The mother across the aisle had stopped recording and looked deeply embarrassed for having captured the incident. Dr. Chen continued. Colonel Wilson not only served with distinction in combat, but also helped implement integration policies that changed the culture of several military bases. His dissertation on leadership diversity is still required reading at the Air Force Academy. James cleared his throat. Please, this is unnecessary. I'm just trying to get to my grandson's graduation without any trouble. Sir, you deserve respect, not trouble, Carlos said firmly. He turned to Melissa. We need to speak privately. Now. Melissa, now visibly shaken, followed Carlos to the galley area. The murmurs in the cabin continued as passengers discussed what they had witnessed. Dr. Chen took a seat that had opened up near James. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you, Colonel. I teach my students about your contributions every semester. When I saw how you were being treated. James looked at her with understanding. Thank you for your support, Dr. Chen, but I've dealt with worse. What concerns me is that not everyone in my position has their accomplishments to shield them from such treatment. As they spoke, the lead flight attendant emerged from the front of the plane, heading straight for the galley where Carlos and Melissa were talking. The situation was about to take another turn, and the truth about James Wilson was spreading throughout the aircraft with each passing minute. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Morrison, emerged from the galley with Carlos and a visibly shaken Melissa trailing behind. Patricia's face showed a mixture of concern and professionalism as she approached James's seat. Colonel Wilson, she said, her voice respectful and warm, I want to personally apologize for any discomfort you've experienced on our flight today. Carlos has informed me of the situation, and I assure you it will be addressed appropriately. James nodded, still maintaining his dignified composure. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your concern. Patricia turned to the other passengers who were watching intently. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for any disruption to your flight. We strive to provide excellent service to all our passengers, and we take any lapses in that service very seriously. Behind Patricia, Melissa stood with her eyes downcast, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Carlos remained beside her, his expression stern. Patricia leaned closer to James and spoke more quietly. Sir, if you'd be more comfortable, we have an empty seat in the private first-class section near the front. We would be honored to relocate you there for the remainder of the flight. Before James could respond, a tall man in his 60s stood up from a few rows back. He wore a polo shirt with a Veterans Organization logo embroidered on it. Excuse me, he said in a deep voice that carried authority. Colonel Wilson, I'm retired Major Frank Downey. I served in the 44th as well, though a few years after your command. Your leadership reforms were still benefiting the unit when I arrived. He extended his hand. It's a privilege to meet you, sir. James stood to shake the major's hand. Other passengers watched with growing interest as the true measure of the man Melissa had disrespected became increasingly apparent. The honor is mine, Major, James replied. The 44th had excellent officers. Another passenger, a woman in her 30s wearing an Air Force veteran's cap, approached from economy class. Colonel Wilson, Staff Sergeant Alicia Washington, I read about your leadership during my training. You broke barriers that made my career possible, sir. The situation was rapidly transforming. What had begun as an ugly display of prejudice was becoming an impromptu recognition of James's lifetime of service and achievement. Patricia looked increasingly mortified as more military connections emerged. She turned to Melissa. Please assist in the economy cabin for the remainder of the flight. she said firmly but quietly. As Melissa prepared to leave, her face now flushed with shame, James surprised everyone. "Miss Barker," he called calmly. Melissa froze, then slowly turned to face him, clearly expecting further criticism. "I've spent my career teaching young officers that mistakes are opportunities for growth," James said, his voice carrying no anger. 35 years in uniform taught me that how we respond to our errors defines us more than the errors themselves. The cabin fell silent as passengers listened to his words. "I don't want your career damaged by this incident," he continued. "What I would like is for you to remember that appearances can be deceiving. The elderly black man in seat 3 at today might be a colonel tomorrow." Melissa's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," James replied. "Just do better next time." Patricia looked at James with newfound respect. "Colonel, your generosity of spirit is remarkable." The businessman who had defended James earlier spoke up. "Sir, I'm a CEO of a manufacturing company. We could use someone with your leadership philosophy to speak to our management team about inclusion. Would you consider it?" Before James could respond, Dr. Chen interjected. "The colonel is actually a sought-after speaker on leadership and diversity. His fee usually starts at $10,000 per engagement." Several passengers laughed, breaking the tension. James smiled slightly and shook his head. "I'm just a retired old soldier heading to see my grandson graduate," he said. "But thank you all for your kind words." As Melissa left for the economy section, James declined Patricia's offer to move seats. "I'm comfortable right here," he said firmly. "And I believe I was promised chicken, which I still haven't had the chance to eat." Patricia herself served his meal, and for the remainder of the flight, the first-class cabin buzzed with conversations about service, respect, and the quiet dignity of the elderly man in seat 3, who had turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson in leadership that none of the passengers would soon forget. The remainder of the flight took on a completely different atmosphere. James finally ate his meal, though it had gone cold during the commotion. Patricia personally brought him a fresh cup of coffee and checked on him regularly. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had witnessed the incident were talking in hushed tones. Some were searching on their phones for more information about Colonel Wilson. Others were sharing the story with passengers who had missed the initial confrontation. "Did you see his military ID?" the elderly woman behind James asked her husband. "All those ribbons. My goodness, the things that man must have seen." In the economy section, word had spread quickly. Flight attendants coming forward for supplies glanced at James with respect and curiosity. Melissa remained in the back, her face still flushed with embarrassment. About an hour before landing, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds speaking. We're beginning our initial descent into Washington, D.C. Current weather is clear skies with a temperature of 68 degrees. We should be arriving about 10 minutes ahead of schedule." There was a pause. Then the captain continued. "I've also been informed that we have the honor of having Colonel James Wilson on board with us today. As a former Air Force pilot myself, I want to express my personal gratitude for your service, Colonel. It's a privilege to have you on our aircraft." Passengers throughout the plane began to applaud. James raised his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement, though he looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Dr. Chen leaned over. "Your influence extends further than you might realize, Colonel. My students are always inspired by your story, especially how you handled discrimination throughout your career." James nodded thoughtfully. "The uniform helped," he said quietly. "People see the rank, not the race. Out of uniform," he gestured to the cabin around them. "Well, today is a reminder that we still have work to do." Major Downey, who had taken a seat nearby after the earlier interaction, joined the conversation. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what was the hardest part?" "Being one of the first black officers to reach your rank." James considered the question. "The hardest part was always the loneliness," he finally replied. "Being the only one in the room who looked like me. Having no one to talk to who understood both the military culture and the experience of being black in America." Several nearby passengers listened intently, many with somber expressions as they considered his words. "That's why your grandson's graduation is so important to me," James continued. "He's entering a world with more doors open than I had, though not all doors. Progress comes slowly, but it does come." As the plane began its descent, Patricia returned to James's seat. "Colonel Wilson, the airline would like to offer you our sincere apologies again for today's incident. Our customer service team will be meeting the aircraft, and they'd like to speak with you if you're willing." James shook his head. "That won't be necessary. I have a graduation to attend." "At the very least, sir, we'd like to provide you with a voucher for future travel and an upgrade on your return flight," Patricia insisted. "If you want to do something meaningful," James replied, "invest in better training for your staff. What happened to me today happens to people without military IDs every day." Patricia nodded seriously. "I understand, sir. And I agree. I'll personally see that your suggestion reaches our corporate leadership." As the plane touched down at Reagan National Airport, James gathered his belongings. The elderly couple behind him insisted he go ahead of them. Other passengers made way, many nodding respectfully or offering brief thanks for his service. At the door of the aircraft, Carlos stood with Patricia. "Colonel Wilson," Carlos said, "I called my father during our layover. He couldn't believe you remembered him after all these years. He asked me to give you his best and said your leadership changed his life." James smiled genuinely for the first time since boarding. "Tell Miguel his radio work during that sandstorm in '93 saved lives. I never forget the good ones." As James walked up the jet bridge, several passengers followed at a respectful distance, some taking photos, others simply watching the straight-backed figure of the retired colonel who had turned a moment of racism into a lesson in dignity that none of them would soon forget. The story of what happened on Flight 1423 spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Dr. Sandra Chen had posted a brief account on her social media page before the plane even reached the gate. "Today I witnessed both the worst and best of humanity on my flight," she wrote. Colonel James Wilson, a decorated war hero and pioneering military leader, was racially profiled and humiliated by a flight attendant who saw only his skin color, not his lifetime of extraordinary service. By the time James reached his hotel, her post had been shared thousands of times. News outlets were already reaching out to Dr. Chen for interviews. The airline's social media team was in crisis mode, responding to hundreds of angry comments. James, unaware of the growing storm, took a taxi to his hotel. His focus remained on tomorrow's graduation ceremony, not on the incident that was rapidly becoming national news. He checked into his room, hung up his suit for tomorrow, and called his daughter. "Dad, are you watching the news?" Janet asked immediately. "Someone posted about what happened on your flight. It's everywhere." James sighed deeply. "Janet, it was nothing. Just an unfortunate misunderstanding." "Dad, it wasn't nothing. People are outraged. The airline's stock is already dropping. They've issued a statement apologizing to an unnamed distinguished veteran who was mistreated by their staff." James sat heavily on the edge of the bed. "This isn't what I wanted. Tomorrow is about Marcus, not about me or some incident on a plane." Marcus saw the posts. "He's proud of how you handled it, Dad. We all are." After finishing his call with Janet, James turned on the television. Sure enough, the story was running on the evening news. "An airline faces serious backlash after a flight attendant allegedly racially profiled the decorated black veteran," the reporter said. Colonel James Wilson, whose pioneering career broke barriers in the military, was reportedly questioned about his right to sit in first class and subjected to rude and dismissive treatment. The report cut to an interview with a passenger from the flight. It was the businessman who had defended James. "What I witnessed was shameful," he said. But Colonel Wilson's response was remarkable. He showed more dignity and forgiveness than most people could manage in that situation. James turned off the television and rubbed his temples. His military career had taught him to avoid publicity. He had always preferred to let his work speak for itself. His phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with the airline's name. "Colonel Wilson, this is Michael Thompson, Vice President of Customer Experience at the airline. I can't begin to express how deeply sorry we are for what happened today. Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your call, but this has been blown out of proportion," James replied. "Sir, with respect, we disagree. What happened was unacceptable. Our CEO would like to speak with you personally. We're also launching a complete review of our training procedures." "What about Ms. Barker?" James asked. "The flight attendant." There was a pause. She has been suspended pending investigation, which is standard procedure. I don't want her fired, James said firmly. People deserve the chance to learn from their mistakes. Your compassion is admirable, Colonel, but we have strict policies about discrimination. After the call ended, James received another, this one from a national morning news show wanting an interview. Then another from a veterans organization planning to issue a formal statement condemning the airline. Then his former commanding officer, who had heard the news and was outraged on his behalf. James declined all interviews. This wasn't how he had planned to spend the evening before his grandson's graduation. As he unpacked his bag, he found the small gift box containing the present for Marcus, a set of captain's bars that had belonged to James when he received his first promotion, along with a handwritten letter about leadership and integrity. Looking at those bars, James thought about how much had changed since he first wore them, and how much hadn't. The incident on the plane was a reminder that, uniform or not, the color of his skin still shaped how some people saw him. His phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Grandad, you're trending on Twitter. Hashtag Colonel Wilson's dignity is the top hashtag right now. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. You've always been my hero, but now the whole world knows why." James smiled despite himself. Perhaps some good would come from this unwanted attention after all. 3 months after the incident on Flight 1423, Colonel James Wilson stood at a podium in the airline's corporate headquarters. Behind him hung a large banner that read, "Respect has no color. New initiatives in customer service excellence." The room was filled with airline executives, training staff, and a select group of flight attendants. When I boarded that flight to my grandson's graduation, I never expected to become the center of a national conversation, James began, his deep voice steady and clear. I've spent most of my life avoiding the spotlight, preferring to let my work speak for itself. In the front row sat Melissa Barker. After her suspension, she had written James a lengthy letter of apology. Rather than accepting the paid leave the airline offered, she had asked to be part of the solution. The incident that day was unfortunate, James continued. But what matters most is what we learn from our mistakes. That's something I emphasized throughout my military career, and it's something I believe applies to all aspects of life. The airline had invited James to help develop a new training program focused on unconscious bias and respectful customer interactions. What had started as a PR disaster had evolved into a genuine commitment to change. True respect isn't about treating people well once you know their credentials, James said. It's about treating everyone with dignity regardless of who you think they might be. In the months since the incident, James had received thousands of messages from people sharing similar experiences. Veterans, people of color, individuals with disabilities, all had stories about being judged by their appearance rather than their character. My grandson Marcus asked me why I agreed to work with the airline instead of suing them, James said with a small smile. I told him that changing systems is more important than punishing individuals. That's a lesson I learned commanding diverse units during times of transition in our military. After the presentation, the airline's CEO presented James with a lifetime of free first-class travel and announced a new scholarship program in his name for minority students pursuing careers in aviation. As the crowd mingled during the reception, Melissa approached James nervously. "Colonel Wilson," she said quietly, "thank you for giving me the chance to learn and grow. Most people wouldn't have shown such forgiveness." James looked at her thoughtfully. "Ms. Barker, in my 35 years of service, I learned that most people rise or fall to the expectations we set for them. I expected you to learn from this experience, and you have." Carlos joined them, now wearing a senior flight attendant's uniform. "Colonel, my father is here today. He drove all the way from San Antonio to meet you again." An older Hispanic man approached with a military bearing similar to James's own. "Colonel Wilson," he said with evident emotion, "Staff Sergeant Miguel Rivera reporting, sir." James broke into a wide smile and embraced his former subordinate. "Miguel, you haven't changed a bit." "All thanks to you, sir," Miguel replied. "When they wanted to discharge me after my injury, you fought for me. You told them my brain still worked fine even if my leg didn't. That changed my whole life." James nodded, remembering. "The military wastes too much talent with narrow thinking. I just did what was right." "That's what you always did, sir," Miguel said. "And from what my son tells me, you're still doing it." As the reception continued, Dr. Sandra Chen approached with a young woman beside her. Colonel Wilson, this is my student, Jessica Roberts. She's writing her thesis on leadership during military integration. Would you mind if she asked you a few questions? James agreed, and soon found himself sharing stories from his early career with the eager student. He told her about being one of 5 black cadets in his class, about commanding white officers who had never served under a black leader, about making difficult decisions during combat that saved lives. As the day concluded, James stood by the window looking out at the airport runways below. Planes took off and landed in a carefully choreographed dance, carrying thousands of people from diverse backgrounds to destinations around the world. The airline's training director joined him. Colonel, what you've helped us create here will impact millions of passengers and thousands of employees, all because you chose education over anger. James smiled. My grandson asked me recently what I'm most proud of in my career. I told him it wasn't the medals or the rank. It was the doors I helped open for those coming after me. He watched another plane take off, climbing steadily into the clear blue sky. Sometimes, he said quietly, dignity is the most powerful response to disrespect, and sometimes an unfortunate moment can become the catalyst for necessary change.